Phillip's first speaker event. We have Phillip here to talk to us about things. Yeah, it's going to go on for about an hour.
50 minutes.
50 minutes, and after that we can stay for the discussion portion maybe. Some of us might go eat, some of us might stay. You know, feel free to do whatever you want. But here's Phillip.
Okay, well thank you for inviting me to the Philosophy Club. What I plan to do is just fairly informal introduction to topic in metaphysics. It's also an active contemporary research topic, so it'll give you a sense of what metaphysicians do, at least analytic metaphysicians, who approach metaphysics through analytic philosophy. And by the way, if you want to interrupt as well, especially if there's like a point of clarification or something you just don't understand, feel free to ask a question while we're going. Okay, so I titled the talk, "How is Change Possible?" So the idea is, of course, change is possible. You know, philosophers often like to deal with puzzles where you know already the answer has to be that yes, it's possible, but you want to know what's the correct way of understanding something. That's the issue today. And I'm going to argue that the correct way of understanding how objects change is through the framework called Four-Dimensionalism. Okay, so I mean, change, of course, is all around us. You know, one day it's cold, the next day it's hot. Now it's light out, soon it'll be dark out. Change isn't a problem, though, from the point of view of today's talk, as long as one event is just being replaced by another event, and then another event, another event. The problem occurs when you ask about how one object that persists through time, an object that somehow is the very same at different points in time, how a persisting object can change. And here there's a traditional problem because it looks like there might be some kind of even contradiction when we talk about change. So let's have as our example, this is an example in the literature. There are reasons why I'm going to want to talk about change in shape as our example. We'll come back to that. So take me, okay? I change in my shape, so now I'm sitting, I have a bent shape. And now I'm standing, I have a straight shape. So it seems that there are two things we can say about me. You know, at the earlier time I said, okay. Let's see if we can get this done. Just a minute. PB is bent, and I was seated. And that was true, I spoke truly. And then we can say PB is straight, well, I mean that in the shape sense, when I was standing, and it's true now. So it seems both of these are true. But of course, these are incompatible properties, right? Nothing is straight. So if PB is straight, that means, you know, that entails PB is not bent. And it looks like we have a straightforward contradiction. PB is bent, PB is not bent. And if there's one thing I'm not going to question here, it's going to be the law of contradiction. If you have a view in philosophy that leads to a contradiction, that's a good reason to reject it. Well, it looks like then the idea that one persisting object, me, can be both bent and straight leads to a problem. Well, it doesn't seem like it should be too hard to solve this problem. Well, let's try one thing that's not really going to quite work before we get to the better way. You might say, well, look, really when I talked about PB being bent, at that time I was talking about a different PB than the PB that I was saying was straight when I was standing. In what sense would that be true? If that were true, we really should have different names, right? You could call the first one PB1 and the second one PB2, and then you see you get rid of the contradiction. Because there's no contradiction to say PB1 is bent and PB2 is not bent. But now, I don't think this works because what I meant to be referring to when I said was me, the person that exists over time, a persisting object, and there's only one of me, right? So the fact that you introduce two names here isn't going to solve the problem if they're both referring to the same thing, which is me. So to express this, I might say, well, PB1 just is PB2. These are just two different names of me that you introduced at different times. And so you're not going to get out of the problem because there's a fundamental principle of logic called Leibniz's law, which says, to write it out here, Leibniz's law for any AB, if A is equal to B, then if A has some property P, B also has P. So here, if A is equal to B, well, this is PB1 is A and PB2 is B, and the property P is being bent. Then we've got both PB1 is bent, and then by applying this principle, we get PB2 is bent. And that contradicts PB2 is not bent. And we have our contradiction right back again using Leibniz's law. And I'm not going to challenge Leibniz's law because that's the most fundamental principle about identity. I mean, think about it. If I'm only talking about one thing under two different names, then I can only be talking about one set of properties. If A is identical to B, then all the properties that A has also are properties that B has because they're the same thing. So that's Leibniz's law. Can't challenge that. Now there's a sense in which we might come back to a way of trying to distinguish something that's bent and something that's straight as being different things, but it can't be me you're talking about in that case. So we'll come back to that. All right. Now, what then is the other obvious attempt to make here to get out of the contradiction? Something has been left out entirely in this discussion, right, and that is time. Really, it seems what we can say is, well, now I'll get rid of PB1 and PB2 because that didn't help. When I say PB is bent, really what I said is PB is bent at a certain time, that time when I was sitting. And when I said PB is straight or not bent, I meant to say PB is straight at a different time, a time when I was standing. If I include the times explicitly, then I no longer will have a contradiction. I mean, the reason you might kind of forget about this is because in English, of course, we don't have to mention the time explicitly because tense is what we call indexical, and the time doesn't have to be mentioned because it's just the time of the utterance is going to be put into it. So when I said at that earlier time, I am sitting or I am bent, the time at which I said it, call it t, is automatically put into the content of what I said. So what I said was, I am sitting at t. I didn't have to mention the t, because you just take it as a fact of English that the time in question is the time at which the utterance was made. But that's how English works. That's how tense works. But if we do include it explicitly, then what we have is the claims that were being made was PB is bent at t, and then let's say the time at which I stood up was t prime. We had PB is straight. Oops, that's an at. PB is straight at t prime, and so not bent at t prime. And lo and behold, we don't seem to have a contradiction anymore because the property being bent at t doesn't contradict being not bent at t prime. They're not direct contradictions. Okay. Should we all be happy now that we solved the problem? Well, in a sense, that's the end of the sort of ancient or old problem of change. I think to note this is enough. But there's sort of the contemporary philosophers have talked about sort of a new problem of change, what's sometimes called the problem of temporary intrinsics, for reasons that will be clear. And this problem, as it's discussed today, was introduced by David Lewis, who was my teacher and thesis advisor back in the day. So let me explain why we can't really stop here. The problem's not totally solved. And the reason is this. And now it's going to be important that I use shape properties here. Okay. So one thing I need for you to get at what the problem is, I need you to have in mind the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic or relational properties. Okay. So intrinsic properties are properties that you have entirely in virtue of the way you are and independently of the way anything in your surroundings is. So natural things for intrinsic would be your shape, your height, your mass, what you're composed of. Those would be your intrinsic properties. Extrinsic properties or relational properties have to do with properties that you have in virtue of things that are going on outside of you. So the fact that you're a brother obviously isn't something that's just a matter of the way you are. It also requires there be someone else out there who has the same parents as you. So that's a relational property, being a brother. The fact that I am about 5 feet from a plant is a relational property. If you just look at me and how I am, you can't tell that I'm 5 feet away from a plant, but you have to look at what's in my surroundings to see that. One way to characterize the difference is in terms of an intuitive notion of duplication. So intrinsic properties will always be shared by duplicates. If two things are duplicates, they have all the same intrinsic properties in common. So it's obvious that for that reason, being 5 feet from a plant isn't an intrinsic property, because a duplicate of me could be 2 feet from the plant and have a different property. So it's not something, not a property a duplicate of me has to share with. So that's a good way to think about it. Now, I also, more relevant here, want you to note that locational properties are extrinsic. So if I say I'm located in Amherst, that's not something you can tell just by looking at me, right? You have to know something about the surroundings. Similarly, to say that I exist in the 21st century. Well, a duplicate of me, exactly like me, could have existed in some other century rather than the 21st century. So if you just think of my intrinsic properties, you can't tell where I'm located in time either. So that'll be all. All right, so now keep in mind the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic. And note that shapes are taken usually to be a paragon example of an intrinsic property. The shape that something has doesn't depend on the things that are around it, something that has in and of itself. Duplicates of that thing always have to have the same shape. All right, now, why is there a problem? The problem is that if I'm right here, that shapes are intrinsic properties, then we can't stop at this solution, because here the property that's being attributed to me is being bent at t, being straight at t prime. These on their face are not intrinsic properties, they're relational properties, saying that I have a certain relation to a time, the bent at relation, if you will, and a different relation to a different time, t prime, the straight at relation. But now, if shapes are intrinsic properties, then these cannot really be shape properties if I'm attributing to them. But presumably they must have something to do with shapes, being bent and being straight. So we need to further analyze what these things are in order to understand how these relations to times relate to genuine shapes. And that's a problem, because it's not obvious how that can be done. Now, I'm going to say that, in my view, there's really only one way it can be done. But before I get to that, I just want to briefly discuss what about a view that held that you don't really have to further analyze these, and we can just say that shapes are, in fact, relational. This person just is sort of denying the basic intuition about, what sorts of things are intrinsic and what aren't. So you might wonder, what sort of argument could you